Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first live webinar of 2019. Today, we're going to touch on an interesting topic in the USA. There's a lot of updates that are upcoming for this year, and we've named this presentation Making American Guidance Understandable Again. There's some initiatives to harmonize in the US, and we think it's going to bring some opportunities for international firms. So we hope you'll enjoy this presentation. Today we'll have two speakers. They will be TJ, Thiel, and myself. So we'll start with some brief introductions. So my name is Boudaud. I have over 10 years experience in the medical device industry, and prior to becoming senior consultant for Brandwood Biomedical, I held roles that included QMS auditor, division regulatory manager for an international company with headquarters in the US. And through those roles, I've had direct involvement with the FDA as part of facility inspections, pre-submissions, and as well as hands-on experience with 510Ks and PMAs. So I've always lucky enough to have interacted with several branches of the agency as well, such as the respiratory branch, radiology, ophthalmic, ear, nose, and throat devices. So I'm hoping to bring some personal perspective as part of this presentation. And I'll now hand over to TJ for his introduction.
Hi, this is TJ Thiel. Thank you for that introduction, Sean. Just to reiterate, really want to focus on, in this webinar, really focus on the harmonization and the opportunities that the FDA is putting forward in recent statements and guidances that they've issued. So that's really going to be the focus of our talk today. By way of background for myself, I've been in regulatory medical device diagnostics and pharmaceuticals for the last 18 plus years. During that time, I've done a lot of work with FDA submissions, FDA audits, so on and so forth, whether it's 510K, PMAs, annual supplements, things like that. Certainly a lot of experience in that. And so again, with Jean, I'm hoping that our combined experience and our interpretation of what FDA is doing right now will be usable to you and will provide you some guidance moving forward.
Thanks, TJ. So before we actually get started with the content of this presentation, I'd like to go through a few housekeeping rules here. So at the bottom of your screen, you should be accessing a control panel. This is a live webinar, but we're actually making a recording of this presentation, so you'll be able to access at a later stage if you're missing anything, or if you'd like to go back to some of the slides on the presentation, you'll be able to access that from our website. Also, as part of this control panel, there is a Q&A button. So we invite you to send through some questions or type in some questions as we move along. And we'll allocate some time at the end of this presentation to go through those. I'd like to thank everyone who submitted their questions ahead of this presentation, and we'll address those ones as part of, or as a priority, I would say, at the end of the presentation. We also had some good recommendations for contents, and we hope that we've covered those. If we haven't, then again, please enter some comments and questions in the bar, and we'll address those or come back to you at a later stage. Okay, so here is our agenda for today. Before we talk about opportunities and changes inside for 2019, we feel like it's important to discuss the current regulatory model and make some comparisons with the rest of the world, between the USA and the rest of the world, so that we can better understand what the implications will be. The first topic that we'll focus on will be 510K modernization. We'll move on to some other important updates that FDA has published. We'll look into opportunities and challenges as a result of those updates and our key takeaways and conclusions. So let's start with a bit of a recap on current regulatory models, and let's compare the two main models which are out there at the moment. Obviously, the GHTF initially framed a lot of regulatory models, particularly for Europe, Australia, Canada, and a number of these, or this model is based basically on a number of rules. And we'd like to compare those with the US. So the main differences are that one of the systems in the GSTF framework is based on rules for classification of medical devices, whilst in the US, it's based on predefined codes and definitions for the classification of devices. One of the systems is based on essential principles, so essentially key requirements for safety and effectiveness, whilst the other is based on clinical experience and predication. So some big contrast there. Obviously, quality management system requirements also differ. In the GHTF framework, 13485 is the standard for application, whereas in the USA, currently FDA operates under 21 CFR 820. There is one big commonality, and that's obviously risk management. So essentially, nobody can regulate and manage everything in detail. So all those models are set in place so that we identify the greatest risks to patient safety and obviously apply resources by inclusion of regulatory involvement or regulatory bodies involvement where they have the greatest effect. So essentially, the higher you go in class and the more regulatory involvement you'll find. So if we now focus in the the US model. So here we've presented in a really summarized form the three types of classes that we'll find for medical devices and IVDs. So there are three types of classes going from the lowest risk and moving to low and moderate risk and then high risk devices. The level of intervention from FDA obviously grows, as we explained before, with those types of devices. So low-risk devices do not incur any pre-market FDA reviews. When we move on to class 2 devices, which include low to moderate risk devices, those will be subject to special controls that are defined by way of specific guidance documents and standards. And those would be required to undertake pre-market notifications or some applications essentially to the FDA and a review by the regulatory agency prior to clearance. So one of the main process that we'll be talking about today is in this category, and that's the 510K process of 510K clearance, as well as another pathway for novel technologies or low to moderate devices, which is called De-Novo. And then obviously leading to the highest class of devices or the high-risk devices. For those, full safety and efficacy reviews are involved and include generally direct clinical data, so clinical trial data. Those will be submitted to the agencies by applications that we called pre-market approvals or PMAs. So let's have a look now at this 510K modernization. Before we do so, we'd like to, talking about 510Ks, there are currently three types of 510K applications. The most common one is the traditional 510K, and that represents about 75% of the 510K applications. By the way, the CDRH indicated that applications and reviews and approvals or clearances of 510Ks represent about 83% of the overall combined clearances and approvals that they actually go through. So that's a very substantial part of their work. And obviously making any change to those pathways would have a very substantial implication on regulatory strategies and onto the industry. So the most common one within those three categories of 510Ks is the traditional 510K. As I said, that's the most common submission, and that's based on a predicate comparison. We'll spend some time to explain what that means. The second type of 510K that we find, which is extremely rarely used, I think, and everyone likes statistics, I think we're talking about 5% here of the total number of 510Ks. Instead of comparing a device to a predicate, the bulk of the application is really based on standard compliance and on how common standards are used between devices. And then special 510Ks are really reserved for changes to devices which have obtained a prior clearance by the FDA, and these are based on design control. So essentially, quality management systems have been followed, a modification was brought to an existing device, and we make a pre-market application to the FDA for them to review and accept those changes. So the traditional 510K program is then again the most common type of 510K, and it consists of obviously a very specific model. So it's a pre-market notification. That's a program which was in place since 1976. So that's a fairly well-tested program, I would say. It is based on substantial equivalence to a legally predicate device or legally marketed device, which we call predicate. So we'll talk very briefly about those terms. So first of all, what's a predicate? A predicate device, as opposed to the definitions that may be interpreted in other jurisdictions, a predicate device is a device which was previously cleared by the FDA. So that's either a 510K cleared product. This could also be a device which was legally marketed prior to implementation of the 510K program, so prior to 1976, and that's called a pre-amendment device. Or it could also be a class 3 medical device, which was later down classified to a class 2.
And just something to add here, it's not very common that there's declassification or lowering of classification in devices by the FDA. When it does happen, it's because there's been a substantial amount of data that's been captured through industry, through continued use, that has suggested that the risk to the end patient is within the low and moderate scope. But those are all devices that have started with the PMA, have likely been on the market for years and years and years, and the FDA has recognized that there are other opportunities, other companies that should be able to bring product to market, so they've down-classified those devices.
Exactly. So what's substantial equivalence? So we said, this is a type of application where the whole point is to demonstrate substantial equivalence, to a legally marketed device. So a substantial equivalence is essentially a comparative analysis. Okay, so it's established with respect to intended use, with respect to design features, performance specifications, standards compliance, etc. So one of the things to understand is this is essentially based on historical products, and so there's further definitions we've added here. What does legally marketed mean? That means that the product obviously has to be in compliance with the regulation. So when you select the predicate, this device has to be obviously still legal, and it has to have been marketed even though it's no longer marketed. So, and I think this is probably a good segue to one of the questions we actually received. How long is the 510K valid for? 510K does not have an expiry date. So you could find essentially pretty old devices in the list of potential predicates, and that comparative analysis will be made really on historical products. So since inception, FDA obviously has done a lot of work on this 510K program. A lot of guidance documents have been published. Some of those guidance documents are product specific, whereby they would describe the kind of information that has to be included in those 510Ks, the kind of testing that's required for those types of products. Other types of guidance would be more technology based. For instance, there's been a lot of published guidance around software, and another set of guidance would be more what we would say process related. More recently, with the advance in technologies, what we've seen, for example, guidances around additive manufacturing or 3D printing. FDA suggests certain ways of validating those processes, and so have published a number of guidance documents. One thing that's that we've experienced throughout the years, and which has been recognized also by the CDRH, is that there is now a much higher data expectation. In fact, since 2009, they've indicated that there is an increase of 150% in the average number of pages. So I think we are now on average around 1,300 pages for an application. I think TJ and I have experiences with certain applications for most complex devices that include electromechanical and software that are well over 3,000, 4,000 pages. So this is just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here when we're putting together a 510K application. Another certainty is that reviews are now stricter. So if we look back, say, from 1976 to nowadays, it is clear that the FDA's reviews are much more thorough than they used to be. In fact, some of the work that has been done by the CDRH is to produce some guidance documents for those reviews to be essentially more consistent across, more consistent across reviewers and divisions. So that's one of the other changes that basically occurred over the years. Another big change was quality administration. So about a couple of years ago, I think it's probably about 4 or 5 years ago now, the FDA had implemented some refuse to accept policies and e-copies. So essentially preliminary steps ahead of the substantial review by the review team to make sure that the content of applications had a minimal set of information. So your application would possibly be rejected should the level of information be insufficient or incomplete to proceed with the substantial review. And obviously an ongoing work which has been happening in the background is the maintenance of the predicate database. So we've talked about product reclassifications. There's been down classes, there's been up classes as well. So this has been obviously one of the things that the FDA has been looking into. There's more changes which obviously have happened. We feel like those are the main ones. We have put a link on this slide for you to refer back to a report produced by the CDRH and which is dated November 2018. So we invite you to have a look if you'd like to have more information on how the process has evolved throughout the year.
Just a couple of things to add here, Jean. I think, as we look at all of these things that have these are been the observations as we've gone through the 510K process since it was installed in 1976. I think you can see that there is a lot of additional burden that's being borne by the industry, by manufacturers. I mean, when we start talking about that there's a higher data expectation and that submissions are getting in the excess of 1,300 pages, I don't believe that was the original intent of the FDA when they set up the 510K process. And some of these things that they've put into place, for consistency on their side, which is great, and I applaud them for that, have also resulted in additional burden to industry and manufacturers. So when we talk about stricter reviews, obviously there's more consistency there at the FDA, but there's more burden on the manufacturer to provide the evidence. The quality administration, having these additional forms and having the e-copy service, yes, provides the FDA a consistent way to obtain and ensure the document meets the minimum requirements, but it's just another thing that industry is doing to do that. And then the last thing I'll just point out, one thing we talk about, there's not a lot of down classification that happens, and it's usually as a result of multiple years of being on the market. Up classification can happen quite easily, and that really stems from post-market surveillance. When we start thinking about devices that have been in the media and have been in the news as failing, a lot of people like to point the finger at the 510K process, and one of the easiest things to do on the FDA side is to up classify those. And that's not what we want from industry. It's not what we want from manufacturers. So I think the FDA has recognized that, and they're doing a good job of trying to address that. And so that's where I think we're going to lead in this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's fair to say that there's been a lot of evolution through this process, most of which, are, let's say, administrative in nature, or just to reinforce the predication mindset. there's not been a general shift in the process since the beginning, and probably it's fair to say also that there's still some very substantial differences in this style of assessment compared to, for example, systems which are based on safety and efficacy and essential principles. So we haven't quite seen yet a shift towards harmonization, and which is something that we now anticipate. So let's have a look through, first of all, some observations. So mostly, as we said, those changes are supporting process efficiency, robustness of reviews, but really the main principles of predications have not evolved that much over the years. And also what this has created is at times limitations in predication option. All of the program is based on historical products. We see more and more novel technologies coming into play, connected devices, new manufacturing processes such as additive manufacturing. It can be, and I mean, we have had hands-on experience with those things. New innovations are brought into devices, and relying on a predication story to present substantial equivalence at times can be challenging. So that's not yet forward-looking, and we'll see how the FDA now would like to address this. So a new shift. In November, end of November last year, a statement was published by the CDRH and the FDA commissioner. There's some very, very strong words into this statement, and we've put a link down there in this slide for you to refer to it if you'd like to have more information. What's clear is that CDRH now recognizes that the program has obviously been effective, but is not a perfect system. And they're talking about establishing a new alternative pathway. So that's a very substantial change. So they're talking about relying on modern safety and performance criteria. So we now hear a bit more about those concepts of, you know, as we've experienced in Europe or in Australia or in Canada, you know, having a set of defined criteria for product types. And the goal of this process or this new pathway would be to allow manufacturers to rely on those objective safety and performance data to demonstrate substantial equivalence. So we would be looking at forward learning, regulatory policies, and a lot of work, you know, being put in this context. So obviously, you know, touching the 510K program is a bit of a big deal. As we said, that impacts a lot of applications. That's the bulk of the work, you know, that's done by the FDA in terms of product applications or medical device applications and IVDs. So, you know, a change into this program is obviously something very substantial. The final rules are proposed to be published in 2019. So I think first half of 2019 we'll start to see, you know, some documents coming through, and you know, we're keen to see basically where you know, this is heading. I'd like to now transition to TJ, who is going to talk about some additional initiatives that the FDA has gone through. And after those other initiatives, we'll talk about possible implications and our takeaways.
Yeah, so there's just one thing I'll add on this slide, Jean, and I think that's really around the wording that the FDA is using in this case. Although this is just a statement and it's just a forward-looking document by the FDA as to what things are to come, I think the fact that they use the wording that they did speaks volumes as to how they're considering and what they consider they need to do in order to make the 510K process usable and understandable again. And when we look at a word like transformative really implies that it's going to have significant change involved. And we've kind of established that, and it is kind of in the text of the statement itself. And then the other word that's interesting to me is the modernize. You know, I think we know that the 510K program's been around for 20 plus years, 30 years at this point, 30 plus years. So we're really, looking for a way to look at current products and how manufacturers innovate and create new products that are demanded by the customers. And FDA has realized that and has suggested that the program itself needs to be modernized to keep up with that demand and industry requirements. As Jean said, I want to just take a quick moment to talk about the other important initiatives that the FDA is going forward with. The first one I wanted to touch base on is just the fact that there is a push for the CDRH in particular, and this was written within their strategic priorities document in 2018, in January of 2018. It's a forward strategic document that basically outlines their initiatives for the next 3 years. And one of the big things that they're pushing in here is that they're trying to explore international convergence, but not change the regulatory standard for marketization or rely on scientific evidence, but find a way to create I don't want to say harmonized, but a more consistent regulatory method or regulatory strategy or regulatory pathway for devices to get to market in the US. And as the FDA was a part of the IMDRF, the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, which, as you guys know, in the last webinar we did in November, we talked about the MedSAP program as being one of the key takeaways from that forum. And the idea that the MedSAP brings is one audit program fulfills the requirements of several regulatory jurisdictions, and those jurisdictions include US, Canada, Japan, Brazil, and Australia. So the push here is that with the strategic initiative, they're looking for an opportunity so that they can create a market authorization decision on one of these jurisdictional countries and then wholly support that marketing in all of the other countries. So basically a one submission approval, and you basically access 5 markets. Now, again, that's very forward looking, and we don't know if that's going to happen or if that's a possibility, but it's good to see that the FDA is looking for those opportunities for regulatory system convergences. If we go on to the next one, I think we can say the same about quality system convergence. So the big statement here, and this was put into rule or into a notice by the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which you can see the screen grab at the bottom. In the spring of 2018, they made a notice that suggested the FDA is planning to adopt ISO 1345-2016. And the reason that they're willing to adopt it at this time is the 2016 version is much closer aligned with the QSR, so 21 CFR 820, than the previous 2003 version. And on top of that, FDA has been participating in the MedSAP program, which we just alluded to earlier. I think that's where we're finally seeing some opportunities for, industry manufacturers to come with a single quality management system, and maybe slight regulatory nuances that are addressed for each individual jurisdictions, but the basic principles stay the same. And if we look at the next slide, we talk about the De-Novo pathway, but just to reiterate the quality system piece, it really is having that focus of getting away from the QSIT to having that MDSAP audit and having that one audit that can fulfill multiple jurisdictional requirements.
And I think just to finish up on this, so obviously, this has been a progressive transition from the FDA. I mean, as TJ has mentioned, the participation in the MDSAP program, to leverage audit resources was one of the earliest initiatives. Obviously, another contributing or facilitator was the realignment of the ISO standards. So that 2016 version, having more considerations to risk management, process validation, and other aspects of QMS that were already included in the 21 CFR and adopted by the FDA. So this is something which has, obviously been moving along for a couple of years. Across 2019, FDA is going to publish some guidance documents on how this adoption is going to effectively occur. And we also anticipate some technical information reports to come through from AMI with comparison of the two standards. There's a lot of commonalities. It's been there for a long time, but we, again, keen to see how this is all going to eventuate.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for that point, John. If we move forward to the De-Novo pathway, again, the De-Novo pathway was placed into effect by the FDA to find an opportunity or to address the opportunity of products that are novel, as in they don't have an appropriate predicate, but they're not of high risk classification that they require a PMA. So that's why the De-Novo pathway was created. However, it's been my experience, it's been kind of industry's experience, it's been also the FDA's observation that it really hasn't been as effective as they'd like it to be. So with that, there has been a proposal for improvements to the De Novo pathway. And that's where, again, the guidance is extremely high level. But in this statement, they want the process to be much more transparent. They want to have better and clearer data. They want to be able to do this so that there's help in the transitional change in the 510K program. So again, they're outlining or realizing that the 510K program needs this modernization. The De Novo pathway is there to support the other novel devices. So they're putting out other guidances around this De Novo pathway. And one plug I'll make right now is that right now, the rule is out for public comment. And as I always tell everyone, this is our one opportunity as a manufacturer or as industry to go back and provide our comment, our feedback to these proposed rules. So please, if you do one thing out of this meeting, please go take a look at that guidance. The link is below, and you certainly feel free to provide your specific industry or specific product manufacturer specific details, and provide those comments. Because again, if we don't say anything, then the FDA will not have a reasonable guidance coming out that is usable by industry, and we might be in the same situation where we need to modernize that new program again in 5 years. As an example of this De Novo initiative, I want to just bring up one pilot program that the FDA is undergoing right now, and that's the software pre-certification program. The link is listed there below. In this program, which is targeted to software as a medical device, the idea is that a manufacturer goes through an excellence appraisal. So that's an appraisal of certain De Novo specific content, certain special control requirements, or certain QSR requirements. They go through this appraisal. They're seen as a center of excellence. And then if the De Novo conditions are met, the software as a medical device, or the SMAD is able to be marketed. So that is an excellent start from the FDA. It really is a specific example of what they're talking about in the revisions to the De Novo pathway. There are opportunities there, obviously, for software as medical devices because they are all novel. They don't have predicates, and it will provide a reduced burden pathway. The limitations are, though, that it is limited to those software as medical devices. You need to go through this excellent appraisal before you can actually get into that program, and then we don't know what the timelines look like.
Yeah, and I think so. My take on this is it's pretty much like a sort of preferred supplier, concept, as we've seen, say, in the land of quality management system. And so, if the quality management systems are good, in particular around, say, product development, post-market systems, etc., then there's obviously a high chance that product design inputs will be relevant to the product, correctly translated into the design. And so the FDA, provides incentives to the industry, to submit those De Novos. We're yet to see expansions of that program. As TJ mentioned, this is at the moment limited to software design, and starting from software, I think, makes sense. There's no manufacturing involved for those kind of devices. That means less variables. Everything relies on design. And so, yeah, it's probably a good start. You know, we're hopeful to see some extensions of that program, but certainly a step ahead.
Yes. Moving forward, I think it's what I want to say here is really, you know, we've been dealing with the FDA and 510Ks and the process of approval in the US for quite some time, between John and I. And I think what we wanted to do was just put some slides together to basically give you our estimation as to what to expect of these changes. Now, again, we're going to find out as we go. Obviously, FDA is going to be the one that's leading this charge. However, based on what we're seeing from the statements, based on the initial guidances and rules that are coming out in for comment and public review, I think this is where we're leading with this. So first of all, we believe that there's going to be a progressive shift in the mindset at FDA towards this risk management and common specifications mindset. Again, this is much more aligned with what has been done in Europe, what's been done in Australia, where there's a set of common specifications. You want to call them common technical specs. You want to call them, you know, certain standards to be applied. I think that's where FDA is going. Again, this is because they want to make sure that there's a least burdensome path to getting these 510Ks to the market. And then that also goes into the second one, which is this De-Novo plus the 510K changes are really creating more De-Novo and better transition between the two strategies. So again, we still believe that, you know, a good portion of the devices that are going to be approved in the US are going to be 510Ks. They do have predicates. There are, you know, devices that have been on the market that have the same intended use or same functionality or same materials or whatever, and you've determined them to be a suitable predicate. We believe that the majority of products that still get approved will be 510Ks, but the De Novo pathway provides that additional opportunity for those that don't have a predicate but are of a low to medium risk classification to have a pathway to market. And I think that's the great thing about having both of these things in place.
Yeah.
I think we expect to see a shifting of the data from back-to-back testing to testing against an objective criteria, or, you know, as I'm referring to, a standard or a guidance. So we expect that there will be an idea that instead of automatically doing your testing to show comparative analysis or comparative equivalence to the predicate device, you will be able to do that testing against a consensus standard or a set of common technical specifications, and you'll be able to show safety and effectiveness that way. We certainly believe that they are going to be limiting the scope of what can be used as a predicate device, and that they will not allow devices that are more than 10 years old to be predicate. Again, this is more on the kind of maintenance side for them, so that they can maintain a appropriate set of devices that can be used as predicate. And they are worried that when a new device comes out, that if it's only based on a predicate that's forever, it's old but hasn't been really used that often, or it hasn't been in the marketplace for a while, that there may not be that current safety and effectiveness data that they need.
And sorry, I just want to add something on this. Even if they were to authorize predication on devices which are more than 10 years old, there's probably going to be an expectation for you to include additional information, why you think it's appropriate to predicate on this older device, and why you haven't actually selected as a preference something a little bit more recent that may have benefited from advantages in technologies and recent development.
Yeah, and that goes into the next one here, and that's I believe that they're going to have more assessment of the technology that's selected in applications. Really thinking about why you've chosen the technology you have within your device or within the product that you're putting out there, because ultimately I don't think the expectation is that you just use the same one anymore, and that because the predicate used it, that's the one you have to use, but rather there's an assessment as to the technology being appropriate and the most safety and effectiveness for the end user. We also believe that there's going to be more standard harmonization. again, this goes back to the common specifications mindset, that it really does focus on the fact that there are multiple standards out there across the litany of a different different aspects in medical device manufacturing. Biocompatibility, for instance, there's a reputable ISO standard out there. We believe that there's going to be more of a reliance or an acceptance by the FDA to show compliance to those standards rather than have specific requirements that are required by FDA.
And I think they need to do that anyway. We have seen some limitations and not much incentive to use the abbreviated 510K pathway in the past. With this new concept of common specifications, etc., there is obviously a need, to standardize more, to provide more standards, and device specific guidance. So we need to see that coming.
And that's an excellent point, John. I mean, we brought up the slide earlier about the types of the flavors of 510Ks that are out there, and 75% of them are traditional, and only about 5% use the abbreviated pathway to find or to provide an easier path or a less burdensome path to manufacturers that met standards, that met consensus standards. And I don't think it's been utilized correctly. And so hopefully with this modernization, that there will be a larger set of consensus standards that are available, and that there will be more applications that are applicable to the abbreviated pathway. If we look at some of the other documentation efficiencies we think can be gained moving forward, on your left, we have the technical file and what components documentation make that up. And then on your right, we have the components for the 510K dossier. Although we believe that there's still going to be some unique things that are required as part of a 510K dossier, we believe that the documentation that's being created as part of the DHF in your technical file will be much more closely aligned with the risk analysis summary, the product specification and the description, those specific documents that used to be another document that you had to create if you were doing multiple geographies. We believe that there's going to be some alignment and some synergies that are gained in these new guidances, so that we may not get to a one technical dossier fits all, but we'll get a lot more closely aligned.
Yeah, and I think, the experience has been that currently anyway, particularly, in the context of class 2 products and predications, you pretty much have two streams of development, or at least test programs. It's always been a bit of a special case, to go in the US, accommodate for special kind of testing, comparative analysis, etc. With more standardization, harmonization, common specifications, ideally you do want to see, obviously, this common set of data being used across the different regions and jurisdictions, even though you'll still have to have, your separate applications to notified bodies, to the TGA, to the FDA, and to the different organizations. Having a common set of data is definitely going to be bringing some efficiencies. So,
absolutely. Again, as we continue on the journey of what we expect, I think it's pretty obvious that there's likely some post-market phase requirements, additional requirements that are much more forward-looking as part of the regulation in the post-market phase. And again, this comes at, it's kind of the trade-off. If you find an easier path to market, or you have a less burdensome path to market, often that means that there needs to be more scrutiny on the post-market side. And this is again, to prevent the issues that have come out with breast implants, with the metal-on-metal hips. They all use the 510K pathway, but were found to be, not safe and effective, once they got into market. This is, kind of the trade-off that industry has to go through. We believe that FDA will encourage pre-subs. We think that they're going to continue to push on. Please come see us. We'll talk through the strategy. We'll talk about your classification. We'll discuss the things that need to be outlined in your submission to make it successful. It's kind of a catch-22 here, because I think they're going to encourage it, but if they give us guidance that's very well recognized, that's harmonized, or is more aligned, that I think we're going to need pre-submission meetings less. So if we get a set of consensus standards and we know that if we meet those consensus standards that we can move forward with a 510K, I believe that that will be something that won't likely end up in more pre-submission meetings. So that's one to be seen. We do expect the changes to the inspection model from the QSIT to the MedSAP. Again, we spoke about this in our last webinar in November, but really the idea that FDA is going to, as part of the IMDRF, do this individual audit, and you will be able to cover multiple jurisdictions. That's going to be something that's being pushed by all of these regulatory jurisdictions. In fact, you think about Canada. Canada does not do ChemDeCAS anymore. It is all MedSAP. So we think that there's going to be a little bit more alignment by the FDA. And as I said, all of these are speculation on our part, but we're basing it on some education and experience. I think the one thing we can guarantee is that there's going to be a lot more guidances and a lot more opportunities for industry and manufacturers to provide some input. So again, I'll get on my soapbox and say, anytime that we have an opportunity to affect or do some advocacy on these guidances, please be involved. And even if you just review it and say you're okay with it, your company's okay with it, I think that's helpful, because we need the documents to work for us and also work for the FDA, so that we get safe and effective products out there.
And certainly regulatory agencies are open to those comments. They're trying to collect the full picture before implementing any guidelines. So the more inputs we have and experience brought into those documents, and the more efficient the process will become. So okay, so in terms of challenges and opportunities, we've sort of obviously through this presentation we touched on those. We'd like to start with possible challenges and maybe finish on a more positive note. Obviously, if a lot of guidance documents will be published, and if there are transitions in this mindset, the impact on FDA resourcing is yet to be seen. So we don't know yet if timing for approval of applications or clearances will be affected, or if the cost of those reviews, will be altered, in response to basically those initiatives. There's also a possibility that FDA, with bringing along new common specifications or encouraging more innovations, we'll have to use additional expert panels and potentially external committees as part of those reviews. So we need to see what's going to be the proportion of review that can be taken internally, and which part of the applications and how often they need to interact with external panels. There's obviously always, as changes come into play, transition periods. They're talking about publishing of those guidance documents, or a lot of guidance documents, in 2019. That's to set the program. That's not saying that the harmonization will come at that stage, but obviously transition periods will apply, and that's obviously a little bit disruptive. And obviously we need to see if there's going to be impact on their infrastructure. So if they reinforce post-market surveillance, for instance, with the need to upgrade their IT systems, all those sorts of things have to be worked out. Obviously, there's some consistency that we can anticipate at the level of the technical information. We're still not quite yet in a scenario where the classification of devices is completely harmonized. So we're far from a common application. We still have to bring special regional considerations, as part of design and development. So that's still obviously, a remaining challenge there. There's standard harmonization is going to be a big trend. At the moment, there's still a huge opportunity. I mean, 13485 for quality management system is now looking to be adopted. The biocompatibility was another one, ISO 10993. That's been progressively recognized by the FDA, and they're progressively sort of moving away from original guidances. There are still like a whole range of processes and and standards which are not fully harmonized. And special requirements exist for software development, usability, electrical safety. So still huge opportunities for harmonization.
And one thing I'll add here is, as we find more opportunities for harmonization, I think it's very important for manufacturers and industry to be 100% aware of what is the requirements under those standards for your product development and your manufacturing. So plug for the next webinar in February by Brantwood. We will have Arthur Brantwood and James Morrison have a discussion about the changing standards, specifically biocompatibility, and what physical and chemical information that companies will need in order to support their regulatory or design and development processes, and then how that all fits into the risk management process for your manufacturing. So again, that'll be in February, but just a plug for that upcoming activity.
Yeah, thanks for that, TJ. Thank you. And then obviously, I sort of touched on this before. Regulatory mechanisms are still specific to local legal context. So we've provided this advice in previous webinars or in presentations if you've seen us live. Take a global view during design and development. I mean, you need to get regulatory involved as early as possible in the process. Make sure that all local requirements are understood, so that you've got a plan for design and development, and you identify the correct pathways. And there'll be opportunities for commonalities, but also uniqueness in data requirements or applications. So this has to be considered, and that remains a challenge. So what's in it for you with all of those changes? So changes can obviously be disruptive, but they're also great means of opportunities. And we think there's really ways here of contributing with the regulator through consultations and public feedback. A lot of the, as we mentioned before, guidance documents and standards are going to be published. So that's a great opportunity to be in touch with the regulator. There's a number of forums that you can use to be in touch with regulators. There's going to be industry groups. You can also, through consultations, group of consultants with ourselves, for example, we participate in a lot of groups and provide feedback to regulators through those formats. But also involving your technical experts through standards committees is going to be a great opportunity here. Another obviously opportunity that we sort of touched on before is the interest in MDSAP, which is growing. So FDA, as we presented previously, is now stepping to recognize on 13485. So MDSAP being using 13485 as the basis for its program is now coming in line really with FDA strategy. FDA obviously, has been involved with that program from the beginning, and there's benefits of that program which go beyond the USA, but obviously benefits for types of applications with mutual acceptance of audit reports and so on and so forth. So it's really clear that for a lot of manufacturers, a strategic direction towards MDSAP is going to make more and more sense. Potentially less barriers to innovation. So all of those new guidance documents are obviously in favor of innovative products, so long as, and this is something that we really want to stress on, it's not going to be obviously about just bringing innovation for the sake of making the product more exotic, but more so for the sake of truly benefiting patients and users. Once this innovation has been implemented on the product, those new pathways are going to obviously facilitate and offer new channels to market. And with more harmonization, less country-specific testing would be expected, in which case this may result in cost reductions during design and development.
So, and one thing to add here, and you got it as the last bullet point, clinical trials is a good opportunity for this harmonization. Again, I think, the current standard for the FDA was 3 trial sites in the US, and I think they've been more accepting of European and, international data with some data coming from the US. So that provides a lot of opportunity to manufacturers to do testing in multiple locations so that it fits multiple requirements for different geographies, different regulators, and then being able to present all of that together to the FDA would be suitable for a 510K or a De Novo pathway product.
Exactly, and so long as the data, is clinically representative of the local context, this is more and more accepted, and that's part of that overall harmonization. So, in terms of the conclusions, so obviously the US regulations are significantly changing. I mean, FDA is touching on the most used program of reviews. 510K program, as we presented previously, is the program through which most of the clearances and device approvals are going through. So making a change to that program or touching this program is obviously going to be a significant impact and a broad impact to a number of manufacturers. The positive thing here is that more clarity is expected. We'll have new pathways, new channels, more guidance documents. We also talked about the De-Novo process with clarifications expected there. So that's obviously something that we look forward to see. A program modernization brings real opportunities for innovators and also for device innovations, so long as they benefit patients and users. We're not obviously completely in a sense of harmonization. It's certainly a gradual adoption of common practices, adoption of international standards. We've seen that with ISO 10993 previously. We talked about other standards such as software development and other technologies and opportunities for harmonization. But certainly we have a clear move towards international convergence. Similarly on quality management systems, with alignment in requirements and potentially auditing techniques with the new MDSAP program, all of those elements, are definitely moving into a common direction, which is good to see. And we can't stress enough on really one of the greatest opportunities, and that's, I suppose, the core message that we wanted to bring to you, through this webinar. There is a massive opportunity here to get involved in shaping the regulations and the standards. So we need to seize this opportunity, as a group, as the industry, as consultants, and make sure that, the regulator benefits from the full picture and can actually access all relevant information from all perspectives. So that's a very important point, that we wanted to make as part of this webinar. And we hope that, there will be strong contribution from all players there. So this is really the main aspects of the presentation. As we mentioned previously, well, first of all, guidances, are expected soon. A lot of those guidance and standards are promised to be released through 2019. As they come available, obviously, we will provide further updates through blogs, webinars, and so on and so forth. So stay tuned, and we'll definitely provide more updates and information that we hope will be useful to you. We now would like to go on to some of the questions that were submitted ahead of time, and also questions that we've received through this presentation. I think the first question that we received is in regards to e-copies and requirements around e-copies.
Yeah. So the question was whether e-copy was a requirement, and ultimately the e-copy guidance was put out there by the FDA in 2013, which was meant to provide an opportunity or an option for electronic submission of critical, data and documentation. We've all kind of faced our challenges with the system. The e-submitter has been up and down, and there's been back and forth as to how to use it, and whether we still have to submit paper copies or what have you. I can say there are a lot of useful tools on the FDA website, so please go to the e-copy portal, and it'll come back with the tools and use those, because if you can format it the right way, the e-copy can be used successfully.
Yeah, absolutely. And just one thing to add, I think, one of the common questions that we received is whether or not, the paper copies are still required. Back in the days, we used to have multiple copies so paper copies, I should say, in the US letter format. We now have, experience of multiple submissions where we've actually submitted 2 electronic copies directly to the FDA. And we found that so long as the e-copy guidance is followed and that the adequate statements are actually included on the cover letters, this has been perfectly acceptable, and we had success with those. So that simplifies quite greatly the formatting of those applications. Another question that we received was with this intent to recognize the 1345 standard, if we anticipate FDA to require prior certification to that standard ahead of essentially marketing in the USA.
So I think that it's a very good question. I think, what we have to realize is that the quality system regulation for the US is 21 CFR 820, and that's a code of federal regulation requirement or legislation. So as it is legislation, it is put into law by regulators in the US. So we don't expect, unless they pass a law to supersede it with 1345, that 21 CFR 820 will be replaced. What we do expect is that there will be kind of a common understanding that 1345, if you have 1345 certification, that you've met the majority, if not all, of the requirements of 21 CFR 820. And I think that's the biggest thing. Again, when we start talking about consensus standards, this is the piece where having the FDA understand what other things are out there, what other things companies can comply to, and not forcing them to do something uniquely FDA, that's going to be the biggest win for us.
Yeah, and I think, from the point of certification, I mean, currently there is no certification process, for the USA. I mean, the 21 CFI 20 is a system or set of requirements that's followed as part of inspections, but there is no certification per se. So we don't anticipate those requirements for certification or QMS to change. However, obviously, this cross recognition is going to be of benefit for manufacturers. And there's going to be, as we stated before, some technical information reports to be published on the similarities. Lots of similarities can obviously be seen between the 2 standards. I think this is going to further clarify where those junctions and merging can happen on systems. So interesting to see that coming up as well.
Yeah, and again, it's worth suggesting again that MedSAP, the FDA was part of the MedSAP program, and they were part of the IMDRF in creating the MedSAP program. So MedSAP is an extension of 1345. So by proxy, FDA, by being part of that, understands what 1345 means, understands what their unique requirements are per MedSAP, and so should allow manufacturers to meet 1345 through and be certified, and reduce the manufacturer burden to an FDA submission.
Yeah.
Next question that we got was online from Rohit. Rohit asked, do all class 3 devices require a PMA? And the short answer is yes. Based on classification, that's, again, based on risk, it is the highest classification, so it requires a pre-market authorization. Now, there are a couple other pathways, the investigational device exemption and the humanitarian device exemption, but in general, for marketing your product as a class 3 device, it needs to go through the PMA process.
I think we had another question, which was around the access to post-market databases such as Udemy, and whether FDA will have access to those tools. I mean, when it comes to access to post-market data, I think there's it's also part of that general convergence that we see. whether that's Udemy or other sources, that we understand that those databases are going to be made public. So it's quite clear, through access of those databases, but also through participation of those various regulatory bodies in forums such as the IMDRF. There is exchange of information. There are new strings of data coming available or that are accessible from those different regulators. And so, yeah, those regulators talk to each other, and the information will be made available in the next couple of years. I think that's for sure.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to push again is, with the change to the actual, getting approvals or clearances for your devices, the thing that's not going to change is that there's going to be increased requirements on the post-market side. And one of the easiest ways for trend analysis, for assessing whether devices are going to be safe in a country, is looking at other countries where it's already previously been marketed. I think you're going to see, the likes of TGA, Health Canada, Europe, with their competent authorities, and the FDA sharing information through MAUDE, through DANE, through the UDAMED databases, and so that's quite likely.
Yeah. So I think that's what it was in terms of the questions that we received. Obviously, if you've got additional questions that come to mind, upon conclusion of this webinar, you can send us an email at help@brandwoodbiomedical.com. There's a number of other ways that you can get in touch with us as well. We invite you to refer to our website at brandwoodbiomedical.com. You can contact us directly through LinkedIn, and we've provided some links here. And we also invite you to join our YouTube channel, where we also publish. We will be publishing this webinar, but you'll also find there a number of resources which we've provided previously. So once again, thank you very much for your participation and for the questions that were submitted to us. It's been a real pleasure to present this webinar to you, and we hope to see you again.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us.